I was under the sink, hands covered in grime, fixing the damn shower for what felt like the 100th time. The apartment complex had ancient plumbing, and every few months something would leak or break. I didn't mind. I liked fixing things. It gave me a sense of control, stability. That's when I heard the front door slam hard. A breathless, panicked gasp followed. Jason, Emily's voice, high-pitched, rushed. Something was wrong. I crawled out from under the sink just in time to see her charge into the bathroom completely naked. Her skin was flushed, her damp hair sticking to her forehead, and she smelled not like her usual floral perfume but of sweat, alcohol, and something else I couldn't quite place. What the hell? She clutched the door frame, breathing hard. Her eyes darted around the bathroom, wild and desperate, like she was looking for something, an escape route maybe. But she froze the second she saw me on the floor, wrench in hand, shirt damp from the leaking pipe. For a long second, either of us moved. And then I noticed it, a smudge right below her collarbone, a faint reddish mark, and another one lower, just above her ribs. Something in my gut twisted. I stood up slowly, my fingers tightening around the wrench, not in anger, not in aggression, just to ground myself, to stop my hands from shaking. What's going on? My voice came out steady, but it didn't feel like mine. Emily blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then, as if her brain finally caught up to the moment, she snapped into performance mode. Her lips trembled, her eyes glistened, and just like that, my wife, started sobbing. Oh my God, Jason! I was so scared. She rushed toward me, gripping my arms with icy fingers. This crazy guy, he tried to grab me outside the bar. I ran. I didn't know where else to go. Lies. I don't know how I knew, but I did. Every word that came out of her mouth felt rehearsed, like a script she'd practiced in front of a mirror. I pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her properly. The smell on her skin, the marks, the way she kept glancing toward the door like she was expecting someone else to come bursting in. And then something clicked into place. A sound, faint and muffled, a creak from the hallway outside. Someone was there. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened. The hallway was silent now, but that creak, it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been right outside the door. Someone who didn't expect me to be home. Emily must have heard it too, because her whole body tensed. Her breath hitched for just a fraction of a second before she forced out another shaky sob. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking past me, over my shoulder, toward the door. And that's when I knew. I knew exactly what was happening. Emily hadn't been attacked. She hadn't run from some crazy guy outside the bar. She'd been with someone in our apartment, in our bed most likely, and something, me coming home early, a noise, a guilty conscience, though I doubted that, had sent her bolting out of the room, naked and panicked. I exhaled slowly. Jason, I swear I held up a hand, not angrily, not aggressively, just enough to make her stop talking. She bit her lip, waited. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at the bathroom door. My pulse was steady. My thoughts were clear, too clear. I took a step forward and yanked the door open. And there he was, a man, barefoot, shirtless, a pair of jeans barely zipped up. He was frozen mid-step, his back against the hallway wall, his face a perfect mask of sheer caught red-handed panic. I didn't recognize him. I didn't know his name. Didn't care. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Emily let out a choked noise behind me. Jason, don't. The guy lifted his hands like I was about to swing at him. Look, man. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. No anger, no shouting. Just a simple, quiet question. How long? Emily made another pathetic sound, but I didn't turn around. My eyes were locked on the man standing in my home, the man who had been touching my wife. He swallowed. Dude, How long? He hesitated, and in that tiny hesitation, I got my answer. Long enough. Long enough that he didn't know whether to lie or tell the truth. Long enough that Emily, standing behind me, was still trying to figure out how to spin this in her favor. Finally, he sighed. A few months. I nodded once. A strange, bitter calm settled over me. I turned around to face Emily. She was pale now, her hands still clutched against her chest, like she was the victim in all of this. Her lips parted, ready to spit out some new lie, some excuse, some desperate plea for me to believe her. But I didn't need to hear it. I was done listening. Emily was shaking, not because she was sorry, but because she was caught. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. For the first time since she barged in here, she had nothing to say. No quick excuse. No manipulative, tear-soaked performance. Just silence. I could feel her eyes darting between me and the man behind me, like she was trying to calculate the best move, how to twist this, how to survive it. But there was nothing left to twist. I took a slow step toward her, watching her flinch, like I was some kind of threat, like I was the bad guy in all of this. I wasn't even angry anymore. The rage had burned up in a flash, leaving only something cold and sharp in its place. "You were saying?" I asked. My voice was calm, too calm. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands clutched tighter against her chest, as if covering herself up would somehow make this better. "Jason, I held up a finger, not to silence her, but to make her think, to force her to sit in this moment with no escape, no rehearsed sob story. The guy behind me shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married." I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was such a pathetic cliché thing to say. I turned to him, giving him a slow once-over. "You didn't know?" I asked. He hesitated. "She told me she was getting divorced." "Of course she did." I let that sink in. Let Emily stand there listening to her little secret spill out of another man's mouth. The room was suffocatingly quiet, just the dripping of the shower behind me, the faint sound of traffic outside, the shallow, nervous breaths of two people who wished I'd start screaming, because that would be easier, predictable. But I wasn't giving them that. I turned back to Emily. Her face had shifted now, less panic, more calculation. Her mind was working again, gears turning. I saw it before she even opened her mouth. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. There it was, the first attempt at rewriting history. "You were going to tell me?" I repeated flatly. She nodded quickly, as if saying it fast enough might make it true. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Jason. I swear it just..." She made a helpless little motion with her hands. "It just happened." I stared at her. "It just happened?" Emily swallowed hard. "You were always busy, distant. We haven't been, you know, in a long time." I laughed again. This time, she winced. "There it is," I said. "It's my fault." "No!" She reached for me, but I stepped back. Her hands hovered in the air, shaking. "I'm just saying things haven't been the same. You have to see that, right? We stopped connecting and he..." She gestured toward the guy behind me without looking at him. "He made me feel wanted." I absorbed that. Let it sink in. I nodded. "And that's my fault?" Emily hesitated just a second too long. "I'm not saying that," she murmured. The silence that followed was unbearable. And then, suddenly, she changed tactics. "Can we just talk about this? Just you and me?" Her voice was softer now, dripping with fake vulnerability. She took a slow step closer, eyes wide, pleading. "Jason, please. We can fix this. I still love you." I almost laughed again, almost. Instead, I did something worse. I stepped aside. "Tell him to leave." Emily blinked. What I gestured to her little side piece, who had been awkwardly hovering in the hallway, arms crossed like he wished he could disappear. "If you love me," I said calmly. "If you want to fix this, tell him to leave." Emily hesitated. I watched her face twist, watched her throat bob as she swallowed whatever pathetic lie she was about to spit out. And then I saw it, the moment of hesitation, the flicker of indecision. She didn't want him to leave because she wasn't done with him. That was all I needed to know. That hesitation was everything. A second too long, a breath too deep, a flicker in her eyes that said more than any pathetic excuse ever could. Emily didn't want him to leave. Not really. Not yet. She knew she was supposed to say it, knew the script. Go. I love my husband. I made a mistake. But deep down, she wasn't ready to let go of that man. She had no intention of fixing this, no intention of fighting for me, for us, for anything. I felt a strange kind of relief, like someone had finally ripped off a band-aid I'd been too afraid to touch. I turned to the guy in the hallway. He was standing stiffly now, like a child waiting to be scolded. He had the audacity to look guilty, even though he'd clearly been enjoying himself right up until a few minutes ago. I tilted my head toward the door. Go. He blinked. I didn't repeat myself. Something in my face must have convinced him, because after an awkward glance at Emily, he muttered, "Yeah, okay," and shuffled toward the door. His shoes were still by the front entrance, but he didn't bother putting them on. Just grabbed them and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. And then it was just me and her. Emily exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging like she'd just run a marathon. Then, just like that, her face shifted again, this time into something softer, regretful, carefully crafted. "Jason," she whispered. I waited. She stepped forward, reaching out again. I didn't move. Didn't react. Just let her fingertips brush my arm before she hesitated, searching my face for an opening. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said, barely above a breath. I let out a slow, steady exhale. "Emily," I said calmly, "when did you stop respecting me?" Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the question. "What?" she asked. "When?" I repeated. "Because at some point you did. You looked me in the eyes, told me you loved me, and then crawled into bed with another man." I paused, watching her squirm. "And that didn't happen overnight." Her throat bobbed. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple." Emily's eyes glistened, like she was about to cry again. The performance was back. "I never meant to hurt you." A humorless chuckle escaped me. "You did hurt me." She took another step closer. "I still love you." I studied her for a long moment, absorbing every inch of her. "No, you don't," I said finally. Emily flinched. "How can you say that?" "Because if you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." I tilted my head. "And if you had any respect left for me, you'd have at least admitted it when I caught you." Her face crumbled. I could see her scrambling for something, anything that would make me change my mind. "Jason," she whispered again. "Please." But it was too late. I was already gone. Emily must have seen it in my face, that moment when everything between us snapped, the last frayed thread of whatever we once were finally breaking apart. Her lips trembled. Her hands twitched, like she wanted to grab me, hold me in place, make me stay. But I was already gone. Physically, I was still standing there, my feet planted firmly on the bathroom tiles. But inside, something had shut off, the part of me that cared, the part of me that gave a damn. She must have sensed it, because suddenly her desperation shifted into something uglier. Her hands curled into fists. Her breathing changed, shallow and sharp. The victim act slipped, and something else took its place. Frustration, annoyance, like I was the one ruining her night. "So what?" she said bitterly. "You're just walking away?" I blinked at her, slow and steady. "Yeah," I said. "I am." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You're not even going to try? You're just giving up?" I exhaled through my nose, leveling my gaze at her. "Emily, you gave up the second you let him into our bed." Her face twisted. "I made a mistake." "No. You made a choice." She shut her mouth, her eyes flashing with something sharp and defensive. I didn't wait for another excuse. I turned and walked out of the bathroom. My steps felt heavy, but my chest felt lighter, lighter than it had in months, maybe years. Behind me, Emily followed, barefoot on the hardwood. Her voice rose. So that's it? Just like that? She snapped. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter. Just like that, you're going to throw away everything we've built together? I turned, finally looking her in the eyes again. You threw it away. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see the gears turning. Could almost hear the next excuse forming on her tongue. I didn't care anymore. I stepped past her, heading for the door. But then, just as I reached it, she dropped the final bomb. Well, maybe if you weren't such a boring husband, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. I stopped. The silence that followed was thick, electric. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch her out of the corner of my eye. And there it was, that flash of triumph in her expression, like she thought she'd landed the final blow, like she thought that would hurt me. It didn't. It just proved I was making the right choice. I nodded once, exhaling slowly. Then I opened the door, stepped out, and let it close behind me. I didn't look back. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it felt good, sharp, cleansing. My body was still running on some strange combination of adrenaline and hollow detachment, but my mind was clear. I walked to my car without thinking, slipping into the driver's seat, shutting the door. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands on the wheel, breathing, processing. Emily was still inside. Probably pacing. Maybe crying. Maybe punching a pillow in frustration that her little act hadn't worked. Maybe calling him to come back over now that I was gone. The thought should have sent a knife through my chest. Should have made me sick. It didn't. The only thing I felt was a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. I reached for my phone, thumb hovering over my contacts. Who do you even call in a moment like this? A lawyer? A friend? A bartender with a strong enough drink to make you forget the past 2 hours? My thumb hesitated, then tapped a name. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Dude? It was my best friend, Ryan, half asleep but instantly alert from the sound of my breathing alone. What's wrong? I stared out through the windshield, watching the distant headlights of passing cars. She cheated, I said, my voice calm, too calm. I caught her pause then. The sound of rustling sheets. Ryan sitting up, his voice sharpened. Where are you? In my car outside your place. Yeah. Another pause. You want me to come get you? I thought about it. The idea of going somewhere familiar, somewhere safe, was tempting. But there was something I needed to do first. No, I said. I'm going to a hotel. Ryan didn't argue, didn't push. That's why he was my best friend. Text me where you end up, he said instead. You don't have to talk, just let me know you're not driving into a tree or something. A humorless chuckle left my lips. I'm not. Good. Call me if you need anything. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, man. We hung up, and I started the car. Emily was probably expecting me to come back, to storm in for one last argument, to fall into whatever game she had planned next. I wasn't giving her that. I pulled out of the parking lot without another glance at our apartment. No regrets. No second thoughts. I was done. The hotel room was sterile. White sheets, beige walls, a nightstand with a lamp that buzzed faintly when turned on. It smelled like industrial cleaner and something vaguely floral, like someone had sprayed air freshener to cover up the scent of loneliness. I dropped my keys on the table, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. The weight of everything should have hit me by now, the betrayal, the humiliation, the fact that the life I thought I had was now officially over. But it didn't. I just felt quiet. The TV remote sat next to me, untouched. The minibar glowed from across the room, full of overpriced bottles that promised temporary numbness. I ignored both. Instead, I grabbed my phone. No messages from Emily, not a single missed call. I wasn't surprised. She wasn't the type to chase. She was the type to wait, to let the guilt settle, to make me come back first. And if I didn't, she'd shift the story, twist the narrative, make herself the victim. Jason walked out. Jason abandoned me. Jason gave up. I wasn't falling for it. A sharp knock on the door made me tense. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood, crossing the room. My pulse picked up slightly as I unlocked the door. When I pulled it open, Ryan was standing there. He held up a six-pack of beer and a bag of takeout, like a goddamn guardian angel. "Figured you could use this," he said. I exhaled, shaking my head. "I told you I was fine." "Yeah, and I told you I'd let you be," he said, stepping past me into the room. I lied. I shut the door, watching as he set the beer on the table and popped onto the chair like he owned the place. "You eat?" he asked, already unwrapping a burger. I hadn't, but I wasn't hungry. Ryan must have seen something in my face because he shoved a burger at me anyway. "Eat. You look like a ghost." I sighed but took it, sinking onto the bed. The smell of greasy fast food filled the room, something warm and normal in the middle of all this chaos. For a while, we just ate in silence. Then Ryan wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned back. "So," he said, "tell me everything." And for the first time that night I did. I told Ryan everything, every single detail. The sound of the front door slamming, Emily rushing in breathless and naked, the marks on her skin, the guy hiding in the hallway, the moment she hesitated when I asked her to make him leave. I laid it all out, watching his face shift from confusion to anger, to something sharper, something protective. When I finished, Ryan exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Jesus Christ." "Yeah." I took a sip of beer, barely tasting it. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You want me to say it, or do you already know?" I gave him a dry look. "That my wife's a piece of garbage? She's not your wife anymore." I didn't correct him, because he was right. Ryan cracked his knuckles, a habit he had when he was pissed. "You think this is the first time?" I inhaled slowly, staring at the beer bottle in my hand. "No." He nodded, like he'd been expecting that answer. "You think it was just him?" That question sat between us for a long moment. "No," I admitted, "because it wasn't. The signs were there, the late nights, the secretive phone habits, the way she had been distant. But not in a sad way. In a distracted way. Like she was keeping track of something, managing someone. And I had ignored it. Had written it off as stress or boredom or anything except what it really was." Ryan took a slow sip of his beer. "You tell her you're divorcing her yet?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Didn't really seem like the time to bring up paperwork." "Well," he leaned back in the chair, "she sure as hell knows now." Another long silence stretched between us. The hotel air conditioning hummed softly somewhere in the hall. A door closed. Then Ryan spoke again, his voice lower now, steadier. "You did the right thing, man." I stared at the floor, my fingers absently peeling the label off my beer bottle. "Feels like hell though." Ryan didn't sugarcoat it. "Yeah. It's going to suck for a while." I nodded because I already knew that. But at least now, I wasn't stuck in the lie. At least now, I could finally see things for what they really were. I didn't sleep. Even with the hotel room lights dimmed, even with the beer in my system, even with Ryan eventually crashing in the chair, arms crossed, breathing deep and even. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, Emily's face shifting between panic and calculation, the hesitation in her eyes when I told her to send him away, the quiet click of the apartment door closing as I left. Somewhere around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Emily. I let it go to voicemail. Then another buzz. A text. "Jason, can we please just talk?" I locked the screen. A few minutes later, another text. "I don't want to fight. Just come home and let's figure this out." I let out a slow breath, rolling onto my side. Figure this out? Like this was some miscommunication, like we had just drifted apart and needed to find our way back to each other. Like she hadn't been screwing another guy in our bed. Another buzz. "Emily, you're really just going to ignore me?" This shift was starting. She tried regret, tried sympathy. Now came the anger. A few minutes later, Emily. Wow, real mature, Jason. Running away instead of handling this like an adult. I scoffed under my breath, tossing my phone onto the nightstand. Handling this like an adult? That was rich coming from her. Ryan stirred in the chair, cracking one eye open. She texting you? I nodded, rubbing a hand over my face. She apologizing? I huffed. Not really. He grunted. Figures. The phone buzzed again. Emily, you can't just leave me like this. I sat up, swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and picked up my phone again. This time, I typed out a response. Me, I already did. I hit send. A minute passed. No reply. Then 2. Then 5. And finally, I turned my phone off, tossed it back onto the nightstand, and lay back down. Ryan yawned from the chair. You good? For the first time all night, I exhaled. Yeah, I said. I think I am. The sun was rising by the time I finally moved again. Ryan was still asleep in the chair, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open. He'd stayed up with me longer than he probably should have, but that's the kind of guy he was. He never let you drown alone. I reached for my phone, hesitating for just a second before turning it back on. No new messages. Emily had stopped. Maybe she'd given up. Maybe she was waiting. Maybe she was already shifting the story to her friends, spinning some version where I was the bad guy. Didn't matter. I wasn't going back. I stood, stretched, and grabbed my bag. I hadn't packed much, just the essentials I'd thrown together before I left. I needed to go back at some point to get the rest of my things, to start the legal process, to officially end the mess that had been my marriage. But not today. Today, I was leaving. Ryan stirred as I grabbed my keys, blinking sleepily. You heading out? I nodded. You need anything? I thought about it. Thought about all the things I should need right now. A plan, a lawyer, a place to stay longer than one night. But in that moment, the only thing I needed was distance. Nah, I said. I'll figure it out. Ryan pushed himself upright, rubbing his face. You sure? Yeah. He studied me for a second, then nodded. All right. Just don't be a dumbass and disappear. I snorted. No promises. I left the hotel, stepping out into the early morning air. It was crisp, fresh, full of possibility. I didn't look back. Didn't check my phone. Didn't think about Emily. For the first time in a long time, I was finally free.